successful public life and also at the same time held strongly to free market principles. The public life extends, or I should say starts, when he was ambassador to the Netherlands. He's also served as Secretary of the Navy. Ambassador Middendorf was also the U.S. representative to OAS and was recently named ambassador to the European Economic Community. As you probably know, he's also had a remarkably successful career in business in the financial and banking community. On the private side, although my knowledge is somewhat limited, Bill, I know that you're an art collector and connoisseur and also a composer. We thought we would have a small band here and have a march, but given the space constraints,
that's right. Well,
we couldn't do that. So with that, let me allow you to begin your talk on free enterprise or decline, the future of Latin America.
Yes, well, I appreciate it, Steve. And what we need, in addition to the Ludwig von Mises tie, is a Ludwig von Mises march.
Well,
victory march, upward march. Yeah, that isn't a bad idea.
It's not a bad idea.
I could probably write one like that, but it would have to be joyous, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Because he believed in principles of growth and the only true foundation of any kind of growth, actually. Like all of us, I knew von Mises at New York University, and he was a very modest man. His wife is still such a great asset and supporter. And I had the privilege of studying at Harvard under, one of my professors was Schumpeter, who gave a graduate course in the summer of 45, and 46 rather, and I enjoyed taking his course because he had opened my eyes to a lot of economic principles that were not taught in Ecce at Harvard, which is primarily almost entirely a Keynesian course. Almost all of our courses at Harvard in the late 40s were Keynesian. I mean, everything. The whole idea was that the business cycle would improve, and you would cut deficit spending, and then it would decline, and then you would increase deficit spending. But somebody forgot to turn the spigot off, and deficit spending went on both times. In practice, Keynesianism it doesn't work, or it works too well. I mean, it's always the spigot is always open, and so all the theories that we had at Harvard, and we're going out to solve all the problems of the world, it just didn't work out too well. We run these huge deficits. At any rate, can I assume that everyone here is a friend of the Austrian School of Economics? They're all libertarians. I was reading some of the material that you or Murray had sent me recently, and reading about Karl Menger's seminal work in 1873, when he really laid the groundwork for the whole Austrian school, it seems to me, and from which all came he didn't enunciate it as clearly as it was later enunciated, but he at least began the process, and from which, and I wonder whether in time to come, that monumental document couldn't be immortalized. We have to build up our heroes, and so that at least people could begin to talk about that, quote that, rather than Marx and Keynes and all this other nonsense that people, in fashionable cocktail parties are Sandinismo and all these fashionable things that people like to talk about in the trendy left, right? Mm-hmm. We've got to get some trendy right stuff going, and we don't have enough heroes, have we? We've got to build up our heroes, and people in cocktail parties like to talk about, major works and when they might have occurred that might have laid the groundwork. It makes it look like they're on the inside, coupled with the tie and the march. So, at any rate, my talk today is free enterprise or decline, the future of Latin America. I think one of the things I've learned in my travels around Latin America and the Western Hemisphere, with carrying this activity with the Organization of American States, is the majority of the countries in the hemisphere are a long way removed from free enterprise economies. Hernando de Soto, who all of us know here and worked with, and he's with the Institute for Liberty and Democracy in Peru, and I think we all know his studies on the informal society. He said the best that can be said for the majority of the countries in Latin America is that they have some combination of Kolbertism and mercantilism, the mercantile system. Kolbertism, I had to look up, is defined as the policies of Kolbert. Some of you may know about him. He was a minister of Louis XIV in the 17th century, and he called for the support and establishment of industries by state aid or protective tariffs and the creation of monopolies. And the mercantile system had the idea of a country exporting the largest possible quantity of products while importing as little as possible in an effort to achieve a nation's supremacy, sort of an extension of war, over other states as a central policy ingredient. So we had Kolbertism and mercantilism, which dominate the Latin American psyche at the moment, economic thinking. This having been said, it's not a question of decline from free enterprise, since it never has really been established in Latin America, except sporadically and in pockets, primarily in Central America. One must presume that the often avowedly socialist or Marxist proponents of Kolbertism and mercantilistic policies in Latin America have never read Marx's glowing advocacy of free world trade in the opening page of the Communist Manifesto, curiously enough. One of the enduring contributions of the Austrian School of Economics has been its advocacy of private property and its cornerstone role for free enterprise and democracy. I think what most people take for granted in this country is private property and private property rights. This is not an overriding right in Latin America. In fact, you go back to the Emperor Barbarossa influence that the property below the ground, it does not belong to you. This is inherited from Europe. This is spread through Latin America, and indeed many Latins, because of the Calvo doctrine and the confiscation without adequate compensation of many of the means of production in Latin America of foreigners, shows that their respect for property rights is not well founded. Mr. Anthony Fisher, a founder of the Institute for Economic Affairs in London, has been credited by Mrs. Thatcher and the press for creating the climate of opinion which made her election possible. And he recently wrote, "Democracy tends not to work because people don't understand that there's a law of economic cause and consequence. To help the poor, you must have economic growth. Simplistic, well-intentioned hope that government can improve the lot of the poor has been the main reason for government's self-defeating, disastrous growth. To make democracy work," he says, "it's necessary that the public be better informed." And the Van Mises Institute continues to make its contribution for informing the public about the law of economic cause and consequence. And that having been an introduction, I'd like to now give an update on the economic performance of Latin America. In '84, economic activity in Latin America and the Caribbean expanded by 3%, and this was in sharp contrast to about a 1% decline over the prior 2 years, 1 to 3% decline. Nevertheless, the 3% last year is only half of the growth rates that were recorded in the decade of the 1970s, during that period of the whole petrodollar recycling period when they were borrowing heavily from the banks and to finance their growth, the import of capital. Moreover, the growth rate of 1984 slowed down or dropped in 8 countries of the region, and nearly half of these 8 have been unfavorable for 2 or 3 years. I would also like to add that the recent economic growth was not matched by any per capita growth because of the high population growth rates. That's another thing that's often overlooked and not discussed thoroughly in Latin America. This tremendous population explosion. We'll see a doubling of the city of Mexico City to 31 million by a little after the end of this century. It'll be the largest city in the world by a margin, I would suspect. And a doubling of the population of Mexico by year 2010. Yeah, something like that. Doubling from the present 75 million to 150 million, something of that sort. That's going to be very closely be as big as we are in a short, in a predictable number of years. So that's eroding away any economic growth per capita that you might see. And in fact, that and inflation have been wiping out the growth in per capita income in a substantial number of countries. The ultimate crisis point would be in Bolivia, where the peso has gone from less than 100 to the dollar to, what is it now, Ed? It must be 800,000?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, to the dollar in 4 years.
Inflation is something like 8,500%.
Yeah, and that's world-class inflation. People don't recognize that's what that's done is that even makes the German inflation, or the fiat money inflations in the past look like amateur night, doesn't it? And of course, it's what it's done is absolutely eroded, if not destroyed, the standard of living and per capita incomes of the Bolivians. I would say that's down to $100 a year now, something like that. It's got to be the poorest country in the hemisphere right now, and yet it should be one of the richest when you analyze their resources. And isn't that right, John? I mean, they probably have more per capita potential resources than any other country in the hemisphere. So at any rate, so the economic growth in the region in '84 was mostly determined by foreign demand, principally exports to the United States. We took 96% of the growth of exports from Latin America in 1983 and 56% of all the growth in exports from Latin America last year. So we, because of our growth here and our huge trade deficit, have absorbed, and last year we had a $22 billion trade deficit with Latin America. And that figure will be higher this year. And characterized by underutilization of installed domestic production capacity. I should note that the vulnerability of this type of growth is very obvious. On a per capita basis, gross domestic product in Latin America and the Caribbean declined 10% over the last 2 or 3 years to approximately the 1977 levels, so they retraced all the way back. For the region as a whole, average domestic prices were up 170% last year, after registering 130% the year before and 80% the year before that. And so these developments are undoubtedly the result of these countries' efforts to prevent a sudden drop in economic and employment activities by means of excess creation of fiat money, the old pattern, fiat money inflation. Earlier this year, for example, Bolivia closed its banks because it couldn't print any more money. Why couldn't it print money? Because it costs more. They couldn't pay the printers. They didn't have any money to pay the printers in England. It just didn't even have the money to pay for the paper. It's tragic. And I was recently informed by a member of the OAS staff that those involved in drug trafficking in the countryside, the peasants have ceased to be using the Bolivian currency in the countryside for the business transaction, using instead coca leaves. The most positive feature of the region's growth in '84 was the strengthening of the external accounts last year. They increased their balance of payments surplus on a merchandise basis in '84 by 25% over the $30 billion surplus worldwide that they recorded in '83, reducing their current account deficit to a fraction of the amount at the beginning of the decade, and closed the year with a strong international reserve buildup of nearly $11 billion. Nevertheless, the region still hasn't retained the international reserve positions it had before the debt crisis hit, which, of course, is a salient factor since one of the measures of creditworthiness is the number of months of imports that could be financed out of foreign exchange reserves. The surplus on mercantile merchandise trade of $38 billion generated in '84 resulted from a combination of growth in the value of exports and a moderate 4% growth in the total value of imports. The imports, in effect, haven't been growing at all. And most of the growth over the last 2 years in the external account has come from increasing exports or maintaining exports and reducing to very little, if nothing, their imports. The level of imports recorded in '84 represented a drop of nearly 40% from the level at the start of the decade. Nevertheless, in '84, the region still had almost an $800 million deficit in the balance of payments account, even though they added $11 billion to their reserves due to the transfer abroad of $39 billion, primarily related to debt service expense. Thus, the $11 billion increase in international reserves resulted from a net capital inflow to the region of $11 billion, primarily associated with so-called forced lending under IMF auspices in relation to debt restructuring. That is, when the Citibank Chase run around and get these regional banks in, and everybody goes back and lends them the interest. That's how they added to their reserves last year. That accounts for the entire $11 billion increase in their reserves last year in Latin America. In recent developments, if anything, the foregoing should indicate to the most casual observer that the problems associated with the debt crisis are very far from being over. Now, there have been some pundits that have said the debt crisis is over. I mean, I've seen a couple of New York Times articles and what have you. Well, who in this room would believe that? For goodness sakes. Mexico, for example, cut its oil prices last week in an effort to boost the sales, which account for about 7% of export earnings. June exports were only half of the 1.5 million barrels a day exports that they had a year or two back. In addition, revenue from non-oil exports has declined from a year earlier. Capital flight's on the rise again, and that's ominous, and I'll discuss that later. And inflation is exceeding government projections as a result, largely due to the accelerated deficit spending financed by accelerated monetary emission just prior to the recent elections. Now, this is very ominous. Last weekend in, how do you pronounce that, Otepec? In Otepec, in Mexico. It's a little resort town near Mexico City, I understand. They, at the invitation of President de la Madrid, came together 10 of the Latin American countries for the purpose of discussing how to handle the external debt. Now, this is sort of a continuation of the Cartagena process. Now, that, I think, from some of the reports I read in the Wall Street Journal that came out of it, and some of the other reports I had, this is not necessarily a plus, because I think actively discussed, and I don't have any documentation on this yet, was the possibility of setting up some sort of a debtors cartel. Now, I think this could be ominous. Ominous because several of the countries can pay and will pay and should pay. Some countries like Venezuela have $12 billion in reserves, and they're increasing. Ecuador is back on the upswing. Colombia is on the upswing. They can pay. Paraguay has done very well, very little debt. Central American countries, God knows we're pumping enough dough in there, they're in a position to pay, except for the obvious exception of Nicaragua, of course, which even if it could pay, wouldn't probably want to, following the Castro line. Speaking of Castro, speaking of the Castro line, the most hypocritical advice on how to evade economic consequences on the debt problem is at present coming from Fidel, calling for a debtors cartel, an assumption by of the debt by the U.S. government. Why doesn't the United States monetize the debt, he says. This advice is hypocritical in the extreme, not only because this advice is coming at a time in which he's attempting to reschedule his own debt, but also because Cuba's own debt is among the most onerous in Latin America. Its hard currency debt, $3.4 billion, and that's 5 times its hard currency, 1984 hard currency exports, including re-exports of Soviet oil. You know, they buy some of this cheap Soviet oil and export it around and make a hedge profit. It also owes Cuba also owes the Soviet Union $22 billion. As you know, the Soviets are pumping in there a little over $4 billion a year, 10 to $12 million a day. Soviet willingness to reschedule this debt is part of an overall social relationship between Moscow and Havana, which involves the provision of non-economic services to Cuba of the type which few countries would be willing to grant. In short, the Soviet proxies of Cuba have become the Hessians of the 20th century in support of international terrorism and narco-terrorism. International tyranny and narco-terrorism. They're, as you know, in Ethiopia, Angola, their Hessian forces are everywhere, especially in Nicaragua. While this overview of the Latin economic situation may help us to understand the status quo, i.e. the economic consequences of past policies, it does little in terms of helping us understand the economic causes so that we can better the economic policies for the future, keeping in mind what Alfred North Whitehead said, namely, it's the business of the future to be dangerous. The problem with it's becoming more and more obvious throughout the hemisphere that without a free, dynamic, free enterprise system, governments can neither stimulate nor sustain economic growth nor diversify their economies to foster economic development. What they did in the past was they papered over the socialistic, mercantilistic programs by borrowing the money from abroad. They borrowed $361 billion, or whatever it is, as the oil countries had built up these substantial surpluses on a short-term basis in deposits, demand deposits in the banking system of Germany, United States, Japan, Britain, etc. Those monies, in turn, were lent out after 1973 at longer and longer credits to the Latins and the other developing countries. And so that permitted this tremendous growth on a one-shot basis in Latin America. And for a while there, I think many of the countries felt that they had found the new El Dorado. Somebody described it as the second Marshall Plan. They ran the meter. They got the dough and put it into long-term projects in many cases. Many times they put it into worthwhile projects. Many times they put it into, after 1979 in particular, they put it into balance of payments, shortfalls, maintain the per capita income, standard of living as they hoped. Too often in the past, one heard the truism that first must come a proper infrastructure when it comes to aid or financial support for a country, and that's a truism. You hear that over and over again. You got to first develop the infrastructure, but that led to vastly overblown bureaucracies of government-owned means of production far beyond such basic infrastructure requirements as roads, utilities, and communications. I see where the Mexicans are now trying to sell off a number of parastatals. They're in the hotel business, travel agency business, you name it. I mean, it has nothing to do with the infrastructure. Restaurants, bars, what have you. There's hundreds and hundreds of these parastatals that the government has gotten into throughout Latin America. I might say that 70% of the industrial production of the major debtor countries is owned by the government. If you take Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Mexico. I had a debate with a professor down in Texas, University of Texas in Austin, who claimed that impossible that Mexico could have more than 25% of their industrial production, means of production, industrial production owned by the government. And we sent him some figures, and he was shocked. And he's been an economic professor, a brilliant man, of course, but just hadn't focused on that issue. And I find it shocking to think that the parastatal approach and mentality has gone up by such orders of magnitude in the last decade. Some of it heavily financed by this borrowed capital that they get. Some of it that's had its genesis back to the Alliance for Progress, when we exported socialism to the hemisphere. We did a lot of good things. We did a lot of bad things. With that, we made money too easy, and they were able to afford to get away from the free enterprise, free market approach, and all because we had good intentions. We talked about infrastructure and building all these projects for them, and they got into these things, and they were well-meaning, and we were well-meaning. So they got into every darn industry possible, but without an efficient and limited public sector at a manageable economic cost, and without an overall environment conducive to sound investment, privately owned enterprises are going to be frozen out, unlikely to make their full contribution to the development of commerce. Economic development can no longer be financed externally through massive amounts of foreign aid or foreign borrowing, hallmarks of the 60s and 70s. Now, growth, if it is to come, must come from each country's climate to attract and keep in country local savings and to attract foreign savings. That is, to have a set of motivations and attitudes that are concretely expressed in the absence of civil conflict, a system of generally accepted and enforceable property rights. I keep emphasizing that because people don't realize that that's not ingrained so completely into the Latin psyche. And a system of generally accepted and enforceable property rights with the ability of individuals to enjoy the fruits of their labor without confiscatory systems of taxation or arbitrary seizure of power. 360 major expropriations in Latin America since 1960. We made some studies, all the heavy energy companies and what have you. And just a shocking figure. And I would say that the average compensation was far below the investment value, the true market value. In some cases, they were pleased with the results, glad to get out, but I would say in most cases not. And once burned, twice shy. Many of the we had 50% of all of our overseas investments in Latin America right after World War II. And because of the Calvo Doctrine, the Andean Pact Decision 24, and so many of these other disincentives for foreigners to invest, foreign exchange controls, inability to take money back out again, what have you, that figure has dropped from 50% of our overseas investments to 13%, and that's going south. Is it preordained that we should just be avoiding that hemisphere and putting all our money into the Pacific Basin when we go overseas, or into Europe, where there's a more favorable climate towards investment and property rights? And who's shooting who in the foot? Is it all because the gringo is such a bad guy? Or is it because these folks have made it climate not only unattractive for us, or the Europeans, or the Japanese investors, but unattractive especially for their own people? And so that comes to the whole question of flight capital that goes with it. You know, I mentioned the vast amounts. In fact, so much of this money that's going in there is going right out again. And I'll document that in a moment. So when the government owns so much of the means of production, and pursues policies that significantly distort free market decision-making, the overall prospect for economic growth suffer, and the international commerce goes with it. Latin America must work toward a better balance between the government and free enterprise, so heavily skewed towards state ownership. Unfortunately, we seem to be losing the semantic battle in the minds of Latins when we extol the virtues of free enterprise. I've been to all 31 countries. I've talked to I guess every head and every finance minister and what have you, and everyone that has anything to do with on the subject. It's an unfortunate fact that, and they all agree with me, and I would all agree with you, Lou, and everyone here. The problem is that it starts at the schools. The Marxist teachers have infiltrated the primary schools in many Latin countries. And from that key position, they take advantage of their young charges' formative years to make them feel that Marxism is the natural state of affairs in any society. Therefore, anyone who is opposed to it must be against humanity. Each one of us has at one time or another felt a guilt trip for being for a free enterprise or for, quote, capitalism, end quote. How many of us feel a little bit like we're out of step with humanity sometimes in a dialogue to one of the think tanks when someone is talking about they're for humanity, or they have a soul, and we are for the free enterprise system or the capitalistic system, which is even more evil in bumper sticker debates. Foreign private direct investment becomes economic imperialism in the Marxist-Leninist lexicon. And this economic imperialism opposes, quote, a new international economic order promoted by Willy Brandt, the North-South Dialogue crowd, which calls for a redistribution of the world's wealth. In the Marxist lexicon, we are in a zero-sum game where if one group is to attain greater wealth, read the exploiters, another group must lose it. None of this helps to encourage the much-needed new capital to come in to create the jobs so desperately needed in countries with unemployment levels ranging up to 30 to 40% or higher. In fact, one wonders if Marxists in countries with non-Marxist governments don't hope to keep unemployment levels high in the hopes that the resulting unrest helps bring them to power. And I might add, once they get to power, there's a greater incentive to implode the economy much further down. Why? First of all, nobody can object because they have the police state and they have control of the guns. The block committee system, the East German model, comes in and takes over each state, and the right of assembly is gone. So there's no counter-revolution that could ever come about in a Marxist system. It hasn't been one since 1917, never will be one. It's false optimism to say because the communists have taken over now and the economy goes bad, people will rebel and object to it. That's absolute sheer nonsense. And if anybody has ever lived in one of these, visited a communist country for more than a weekend and not been just exposed to the propaganda of the literacy in the hospitals and all the wonderful things that Marxists talk about when you come in there as a guest of those countries. And you see there's just a little fringe at the top of the 5% who are living high on the hog at the expense of the 95% who are living in far greater poverty than they did before. It doesn't mean that they weren't well-meaning in bringing in the Marxists or helping to bring in the Marxists as they did when they threw out Somoza or threw out Batista. They were well-meaning people, including a number of friends of mine, because I was in business in Cuba in the 50s. But I found out one thing, that all revolutions first eat their young. And all those friends of mine, including Larry Lunt and others, either were killed or spent 15 to 16 years in the slammer under greatest unique amounts of torture. And they were the ones that brought Castro to power. They were the intellectuals. They were the dreamers. And because he was tough and he recognized they were damn fools. And he figures they were damn fool enough to be for me on an ideological basis, then I don't want them around that day after I take over because they'll be damn fools enough to go for the next guy against me. And he put him in the slammer. And that's what happened to my friend Larry, who sold me a farm in Rhode Island, and a lot of combined efforts of Congressman Gilman and Claiborne Pell, and a lot of us, we finally got the guy out of the slammer. But it was a tragic, tragic case, a broken family and everything else. An American, but he'd been for Castro initially. So at any rate, what we have is we need to get the capital into the countries to create jobs. We need to keep the capital in the countries to create jobs and not flight capital. And the reverse has not been true. That has been true. The trend toward government ownership is clearly seen in Mexico, where, according to the trend data, there were 84 government enterprises in 1972. By 1982, there were 760. And during the same period, total government spending as a percent of GDP doubled from 23% to 46%. And then came the famous bank nationalization of Lopez Portillo, for which they were going to build a statue, recall, in the square there in Mexico City. He trumped up these crowds. I happened to be there that time. They trumped up these crowds. I was running around screaming, Lopez, Lopez. I mean, it was the greatest hero they ever saw. He nationalized the banks. It was a very populist type of thing to do. But my goodness, how it absolutely destroyed Mexico. Because the 24% of the industrial production that those banks controlled were the profitable companies left in Mexico that had not had flight capital, and they had modernized and what have you. And of course, once the government took over with all this bureaucracy and layering, that was the end of that game. Following 1982 and the bank nationalization, the great majority of Mexico's major industries were under government control, and the government share of total capital formation had already reached 50%. A good sign for positive change is that some of the empirical research that has been conducted on the macroeconomic consequences of status solutions so long favored in most of Latin America is beginning to receive wider publicity and beginning to affect the thinking of high-level policymakers. Andrew Feltenstein and K. Chung Chu, a couple of economists that I respect, in their paper Relative Price Distortions and Inflation in the Case for Argentina, 1963-76, published by the International Monetary Fund, for example, estimated that in Argentina, government transfers to cover public enterprises losses, the losses from government enterprises, were proportionally 10 times as inflationary as the financing of private enterprises losses through commercial bank borrowings. 10 times as inflationary. Primarily because it's assumed that only in the former case are the losses translated into high-powered money through central bank financing of the government deficit. Because the state of Argentina owns the vast majority, 60-70% of the state-owned enterprises, industrial production, and since most of these enterprises operate at enormous losses, which only the government printing presses can make up, inflation rate there last year was 700%. There's this coal company down there on which $500 million has been invested. It had revenues last year of $30 million and overhead of $90 million. And I'm sure it's layered with every general's ex-cousin in there. That's just one of 330 such enterprises down there. And when I see the IMF putting the hair shirt on Argentina, I can't be optimistic. Yes, it's a plus, but I can't be optimistic until they start selling off some of the parastatals. Because as long as they're running these huge deficits, I don't know if any of them do you know if any are making money? As long as that hemorrhaging is taking place, and they're going to have to continue the presses to pay for those, well, where is the balance going to come in the future? Other equally devastating findings are discussed in Public Enterprises in Mixed Economies by Robert Floyd and Clive Gray and H.P. Short. For 25 developing countries for which data was available, Short estimates the average overall public deficit before reduction of government transfer payments, current transfers, at 5.5% of GDP through the 1970s. He further estimates that the overall deficit in developing countries increased by 2.5 percentage points of GDP between the late 1960s and the mid-70s. Defining budgetary burden of public enterprises, the residual of government transfers and loans, less the loan service payments by the enterprises, Short estimates this burden to average 3.3% of GDP for 34 developing countries. It's unbelievable. That compares with the 4.4% estimate for the central government's overall budget deficit in these countries. In other words, 3/4 of the deficit it can be accounted for by the central government deficit. In spite of these trends, which amount to a fight for survival on the part of free enterprise in many parts of Latin America, there are several counter-trends. A good example was was seen in Peru by the studies by Hernando de Soto, where you're seeing the informal society spring up on a rapid scale. He estimates that it takes a person 6 months to set government approval, set up a simple business in Peru. An informal economic system has grown up to rival the more traditional business. According to De Soto, an informal economy developed and grew despite the tremendous handicap of being illegal. He estimates that the informal economy of Peru now accounts for 90% of Lima's garment industry, 25% of its furniture industry, 60% of housing, and even a good part of the automobile and truck industries, all illegal. The informal Peruvian economy, says the study, has grown so fast that it now accounts for 60% of the overall total Peruvian economy. And almost none of this output is counted in the official $22 billion figure for their GDP. Perhaps most important is the free enterprise system's ability to create jobs in Peru. An estimated 2 out of every 3 jobs are now in the informal illegal society. According to another factor De Soto points out is that the South American economies often have 2 kinds of private sectors. One that is seriously burdened by excessive regulation, hampered by the bureaucratic inefficiency, but is officially sanctioned. That's made legal. And quite often you'll find that many of these government monopolies and even the parastatal approaches are encouraged by private sector leaders who have an official monopoly themselves. So you have to define what you mean by private sector development in these countries. The second, which is by far more in accord with free market principles, but whose existence is barely acknowledged, almost illegal. This difference is made clear by an experiment documented by a study group from De Soto's Institute for Liberty and Democracy, in which he tried to set up a legal garment firm without easing the way with bribes. And it took a lawyer and 3 others 301 days of full-time work dealing with 11 government agencies to complete the paperwork, which, when laid end-to-end, measured 102 feet. One of the researchers then tried the same experiment in Tampa, Florida, and it took 3.5 hours. But the awkward thing is nobody gives a damn. I mean, you can't go to some high official and say, look, it's taking forever to get through the bureaucracy here, and we could bring in jobs. Nobody gives a damn. That's the problem. A friend of mine from Occidental Petroleum, Bob Mahaney, a friend of John's and mine, and Dave Martin, we went to President Celia Suazo early on in his administration, and they were willing to, Occidental Petroleum offered to spend hundreds of millions, approaching $1 billion in Bolivia, for oil exploration, what have you, and to work with a pipeline into Brazil and what have you. The project was nixed because there were 2 communists in the administration who felt that this would be very bad to give away, quote, the national patrimony to the big gringos from the north or whatever, some such perception. And so sometimes you wonder if anybody gives a damn about helping the people. What would $1 billion in that bankrupt country would have accomplished? Think about it. And you thought somebody would have cared. They went elsewhere. They've done a tremendous job in Colombia, and now they've got, they're talking, about 150,000 barrels a day in that new development up there. They've pumped the money in there. To its hopefully enduring credit, the Mexican government, under the leadership of President de la Madrid, also has taken steps of late to deal with excessive government involvement in the economy. In the last issue of Reason magazine, Mexico continues down a denationalization road. The trend began last fall when over 100 state-owned firms were sold back to the private sector. In February, the federal government stock took another step when it announced the sale of 202 more firms and closing of 332 more. That's about about a quarter of the firms owned by the government so far. Of course, the hard nuts are going to be the big ones, because and so often when I talk to the Latins and my friends, they say, sure, we agree with you, Bill. We'd like to sell off these parastatals. You want to buy a steel mill that's losing $30 million a year? We'll give it to you, right? Not give it to you, but let you have it for very little. Who's going to buy it? That's the problem. So Latin America needs vast amounts of capital for progress, or indeed to maintain the present standard of living. So otherwise they're going to be in a free fall. They are in a free fall. According to the IDB study, between now and the year 2000, Latin America and the Caribbean will have to create 100 million new jobs, since half the population is under 20. And the birth rates are running at 3%, with Mexico's up to almost 6%. So the average cost for creating a new job in the region is estimated, what would you say, $12,500 maybe compared to, say, $50,000 or more here, but still $12,500 cost to create a new job. That leads to an approximation of $1.25 trillion in capital will have to be generated in the next 15 years. $1.25 trillion. That's in order for them to maintain the present standard of living with 100 million new jobs going to be created because of this population explosion in Latin America. Now, how does that figure compare to all the money that came in, all that free almost huge volume of lending over the last 10 or 15 years following the oil shocks of 1973 and 79? How would you guess that compares, that $1.25 trillion? Well, that's at least double, if not triple, all the money they've been able to borrow in the borrowing splurges of the 1970s. Well, is it possible when the credit is gone? And how many of you are going to send your savings out from the First American Bank down there to invest in any of those countries, unless you got a tremendous yield and all sorts of guarantees and what have you? In other words, you're not going to freely lend or give your money as you might have in the 70s, right? Anybody anxious to make some clever investments down there? And so, in other words, if you feel that way, then and corporate boardrooms all the way across Europe, Japan, and here, except in extractive industries where they have to go there, well, that's where the minerals are and what have you, or perhaps in some consumer-orientated industries where you can go in and get your money back in sort of 2 or 3 years without a heavy capital investment, tobacco, Coca-Cola type of things. How many are willing to put a long-term 10 or 15-year payout investment into an area that's done such a poor job with its own savings, right? Now, so our job, all of our jobs, is to help turn that around. That's why the Van Mises Institute is a key on this, in my opinion, and other think tanks like this, because the road is open to correct policies, and it can be an explosive, successful opportunity for the Latins and for all of us, for that matter. For Latin America, the decade of the 1960s can be considered the decade of official aid following the Alliance for Progress. That was official aid. Give the money. And the decade of the 1970s was the decade of commercial bank lending, nearly 300 billion in that decade. Then the decade of the 1980s must be the decade of foreign direct investment. That's the solution. They must take in partners, investments. They've got to start developing equity interests. Why? Because regarding future prospects for official aid, it's not going to come. The World Bank, there are going to be incremental support coming from, obviously they're going to continue to be lending but not on the scale that we saw in the 60s, from the International Monetary Fund and the other big multinational lending institutions. Is Citibank and Chase and Riggs Bank going to make the kind of bank loans they made in the 70s? Is that lending potential there? No, absolutely not. I mean, in 1980, the United States institutions, United States had a transfer of capital abroad of $104 billion. Last year, that figure dropped to $6 billion. In other words, it's a cataclysmic reduction in outflows of U.S. capital, mainly because the banks have stopped lending abroad. And furthermore, the sums needed, this $1.25 trillion that the IDB estimates the Latins are going to need, the sums are just too monumental. They're just too great. Second, virtually all the industrialized country governments, including the United States, are grappling with the issue of controlling their own government deficits right now, unlike in the 70s. We're running not only huge deficits here, but huge trade deficits. And that's got to come to an end. And it's beginning to. The Congress is beginning to talk about protectionism. I see it everywhere. Not only against Japan, but in other areas that spill over. But also they're talking about reducing at least the budget deficits. It's unlikely that the industrialized country central banks will be accommodating towards these deficits as they were in the 1970s. That's probably the classic understatement of all time. Wouldn't you agree? Furthermore, it's now widely recognized that Latin America will just only be able to service. Last year there were 38. An economist down there who I respect, and he estimates that Argentine capital abroad is about $27 billion, And that much of this capital left the country during the early 1980s, despite the fact that real interest rates, and often they say we're decapitalizing the rest of the world with these huge capital inflows in the United States because our real interest rates are higher than theirs. The truth of the matter is that their real interest rates in that period when this bulk of this $27 billion left the country amounted to 20%. That were double our U.S. real interest rates. So it isn't a question of relative real interest rates. It's a question of capital flight because they want to get their dough into safer havens, and they see expropriation, and they see inflation and other things like that on the horizon. And he ascribed that to lack of confidence. Victorica does. Now comes Henry Wallach, the Fed, and he made a study, and he says, why is net international investment so small? And he made the following comments. For the world's 8 largest borrowers over the years 74-82, calculations show an increase in debt, that's equity and direct investment included of $317 billion. And while the current account deficit adjusted for changes in official reserves amounts to only $207 billion. Thus, there seems to be a capital outflow of $110 billion. The degree to which borrowing financed this capital outflow differs among countries. For Brazil, only 12% of the inflow was compensated by outflows. For Mexico, 45%. For Venezuela, almost the entire inflow was absorbed into outflows. In other words, 100% flight capital from Venezuela, and according to his figures. This trend has to be reversed in Latin America if it's to grow at all. Unfortunately, too many of the Latin's economic policymakers are constantly surprised by the obvious. The solution to Latin America's problems with flight capital is very simple. It's that those policies of governments that have economic consequences must be in harmony with the criteria used by the rational investor. What are these criteria? The rational investor is interested, one, in a positive rate of return on an after-tax basis adjusted for inflation and consistent with his marginal propensity for security, i.e. a degree of risk aversion. The policy areas that need to be tested for their degree of harmony with the rational investor's criteria are monetary policy, tax policy, and regulatory policy. Moreover, the relationships among the 3 broad policy arenas I've just mentioned must be tested for what is known in logic as the fallacy of composition, i.e. with the purpose of ensuring that the soundness of each policy considered in an isolation is additive or mutually reinforcing in a positive direction. The bold and courageous economic reforms now underway in Argentina, if adhered to, hold promise for an eventual solution to that neighbor's economic determination. The present monetary reform, for example, involves permitting only that level of monetary emission which is consistent with a rise in the central bank's international reserves. Adherence to this policy is basically consistent with a non-inflationary monetary environment, which in turn would eliminate the perceived need for indexation, hopefully. But we all know that these policies have been tried before, and after 6 or 7 months, timbers start to creak. Why? Because, in my opinion, because they haven't, not addressing still the parastatal ownership question, but I'll go on from there for a moment. The kind of economic policy making criteria I've just elaborated are, of course, at the heart of what the media has labeled Reaganomics. In fact, what Argentina is doing in the monetary sphere would appear to be consistent with the ideas of monetary policy elaborated by the U.S. Congress under another great Republican, Abraham Lincoln, who said, "Money is the creature of law, and the original issue of money should be maintained as an exclusive monopoly of national government. Money possesses no value to the state other than given it by circulation. Capital has its proper place and is entitled to every protection. No duty is more imperative on the government than the duty it owes the people to furnish them with a sound and uniform currency and of regulating the circulation of the medium of exchange so that labor will be protected from a vicious currency and commerce will be facilitated by a cheap and safe exchange. By the adoption of these principles," Lincoln said, "the long-felt want for a uniform medium will be satisfied. The taxpayer will be saved immense sums in interest, discounts, and exchanges, the financing of all public enterprise, the maintenance of stable government and ordered progress, and the conduct of the Treasury will become matters of practical administration. The people can and will be furnished with a currency as safe as their own government. A democracy will rise superior. In my opinion, the best way to make the currency safe as their own government is to have it gold-backed. And there's no reason why it shouldn't be gold-backed. In my opinion, we should go back to that policy that we had years ago here. And you can see that throughout the world, the tremendous run-up in inflations that is documentable to the period immediately after 1971. And borrowing is only one of the three types of international monetary transfers. The others are direct aid and government-to-government, or multilateral and foreign direct investment. And I believe foreign direct investment is which brings with it management skills, and which brings with it, in turn, markets back up in the investing countries area, and it creates jobs. To me, foreign direct investment should be the principal role of government, all governments, to try to attract that capital. And I see signs that some of our U.S. aid programs are now encouraging more and more a climate for investment. I met yesterday with Jacques Delosier, and he's doing everything he can to promote that concept, the IMF. And I see at the World Bank a lot of progress being made in that direction. President Reagan is certainly taking the lead on that. George Shultz has made a number of speeches, including the important speech that he made at the OAS General Assembly last November in Brasilia on this subject. And I see awakening in attitudes in Latin America in the 4 years that I've been exposed to Latin America, back with Latin America again. I mean, I remember the first CS meeting I went to, and I think John coached me on that. The attack on the gringo was unbelievable. Everything, we don't want to be exploited by the big gringo from the north. We don't want foreign direct investment, and this type of thing. That type of perception, and the term exploitation, all those terms come out of the North-South dialogue, these new international order type discussions. But I don't see that anymore. I've seen that fade out. People are now talking openly about changing their domestic policies, getting rid of the parastatals. President Alfonsín has made a number of good quotes on that recently, so has Dela Madrid, and he's doing something about it. Brazil has set up a commission to explore the idea of getting rid of some of the parastatals if they can find buyers. And there is progress throughout the hemisphere. I don't know anybody now that is talking about expanding government ownership. On the other hand, new ideas have to be injected. The often quoted statement is, well, who's going to buy the stuff? Well, that isn't necessarily true. I believe that in some cases you can develop the ESOP programs on a modified basis can be useful, selling to the employees. We saw the Weirton Steel case here, a bankrupt company, and in Pittsburgh, and you saw that when the employees took it over and made the necessary cuts, the outfit took off, and I think became, right, Rick, the most successful, highest profit margin steel company in America last year. Leading. In other words, what a turnaround, and I do believe that we saw the case in Guatemala, a number of cases down there. There are 50 now employee stock ownership programs now down there, and the number should expand to 500 in a few years. Companies we saw there, and in one of the plantations there that the employees had a share in agricultural production, and along came the guerrillas, and the employees shot at them and chased them out because they didn't want to be taken over. No, because they had a stake in the place, and they even asked if they could have some deducted from their payrolls some more guns, because these guerrillas were all over the place. And the president even commented on that, because it has been a very successful program that particular one, and it shows that people will work and protect what they have if they know they have a stake in it. And I believe that throughout Latin America, this whole idea of privatization through employee purchases is a very good possibility, and it keeps them on their jobs and what have you. And there are 8,000 corporations in America. Some of the most successful companies here. Almost 10% of our workforce has already gone into an employee stock ownership program here, and I see it expanding here and down in Latin America, just like the La Perla project that I mentioned, which is a coffee plantation, 9,000-acre coffee plantation in Guatemala, with about 1,500 employees and the families down there. I've got some details on it if you're interested in any of the background on that. I have some photographs of showing these folks with all their guns, and as these guerrillas attack on a regular basis. They're always attacking. And at any rate, I feel that, in fact, I talked to Joe Rosinos, he's the representative of the Solidarity Union in Guatemala, about this, and he said we can clearly see that what the true message of ownership and a vested interest in the free enterprise system means in viewing the La Perla model. There's no greater significance to the concept of defending the free enterprise system than a worker laying down his life to defend the company in which he's a co-owner. If we want to prevent further Nicaraguas or El Salvadors, he says the American government must address the problem of economic and social justice in Latin America. Promoting broad capital ownership as an alternative to Marxist philosophy in Latin America, they are actively pushed now as foreign policy objectives, can go a long way in giving people a vested interest in protecting the free enterprise system. And Norman Curlin, who's been very active in this program too, he runs the Center for Economic and Social Justice here in town. And he says to win over Marxist-Leninism, you have to go beyond the military. Of course, you have to be militarily strong. On the other hand, there's an ideological battle. Marx and Engels stated that you can sum up the entire philosophy of communism in a single sentence: abolish private property. The entire case of Marxist-Leninism disappears if we prove to the world that private property is essential for providing economic and social justice and for providing human dignity to people in the third world. Marx was wrong. However, we cannot simply attack him on the basis of the problems he was focusing on, but rather on the basis of the means that he would use. The solution is not to make enemies of the owners, but to make owners of the non-owners. And there's a simple litmus test for evaluating the economic reform efforts now underway in Latin America, and that is, do the proposed policy changes create the incentives and opportunities to acquire private property for all parts of our population? And the degree to which this question can be answered positively will determine whether or not Latin America is on its way to encouraging sustainable growth and recovery. So I see some trends in that direction. I think that this is something that this is the greatest message of America, and we can export that. Why not? We're the greatest public relations operators here in the United States. We can sell soap and toothpaste and all the rest. Why can't we sell the wonderful message of free enterprise and private property and dignity of the individual and the worker and having a stake in his own outfit? Why are we, the greatest media salesmen in the world, not able to combat the most bankrupt philosophy that the world has ever known, Marxism, Leninism, that's just spread throughout all the schools, most of the primary schools in Latin America, and throughout a number of them in Europe? Why are we such lousy salesmen? We really are. And that's where I think Ludwig von Mises was like a light in a dark room, and a beacon light. And that's where I think the von Mises Institute can be the light that becomes a light to light up the whole world. And I think there's a real exciting prospect ahead, not just following the liberalizing ideas of Locke and Rousseau and Adam Smith, but von Mises. With that, Lou, I'd like to end. Yeah.